Hello for our April question and answer, which will, of course, become publicly available in early May. And I should begin with I will begin with what I should begin with much more often, which is a huge, general, multiple thank you to all patrons for continued support, for wanting to be part of Adept Play, for helping this actually to happen at all. This meaning not just, of course, this little Patreon, but the entirety of what I do. The website, the interactions, my upcoming trip to GothCon, all those things. They are not possible without you, and for this, thank you. Not pro forma. That's real. With any luck, we continue with the reality with all these questions that people have brought. And the first coming from Margaret, whom many of you will recognize as Effie, the username from Adept Play. And here I am, rummaging about my desktop for that piece of paper that I just had a few minutes ago with all the little questions on it, which is here. All right. This question says, the little box on one of the maps in HeroQuest 2003 isn't readily available via Google. Okay. The question continues. That's just the opening part, and I will just reassure everyone that I, in fact, have both the aforementioned text and I have that part of the map right here. So we've got that. And then it says, all right, it is informing the reader 5 Arcats return, as you can see. So being somewhat specific, she goes on, the story of Arcat and Nicelor is framed within the backdrop materials for both role-playing games explicitly set in Glorantha and general fan discourses as if it were potentially or imminently relevant to play. All this is true. Or rather, yes, I agree. This is what I see as well. We look at the original RuneQuest, we see the development of RuneQuest, and we see plenty of stuff about Arcat and Nicelor and, of course, Gabaji. And then the question is, what experiences have you had with using this material in play? How did it end up being contextualized? Okay, this is one of those questions where my answer is primarily in the negative and therefore not full of, experience and insight from play and, personal usage of the material, which is really too bad because I would like that to be so. I wish that were the case. And I hopefully can help a bit with context for how anybody might go ahead to answer this question for themselves, but it's not going to land with, and this is how I did it, or this is what I think, from, a baked in play experience. Again, unfortunately. So what do we have here? What are we looking at? The materials in question suffer a little from the historical fact that most of the discourse about Glorantha was, of course, either informal, utterly informal, to the extent of really informal, or variably published in a wide variety of catch-as-catch-can publications. The Worm's footnotes would be, very obscure if they had not been later reprinted. And that's where a great deal of the writing on all these things, including, that magnificent, saga of the lunar goddess origin and things like that. And I don't have all those things. I have some of the actual original issues, not very many. I have maybe just one. I have several of the reprints, but again, not many. There have been other Gloranthan zines produced by many different people. There have been republications. Material, for example, from Troll Pack was then republished later as a standalone scenario. All sorts of things have been rewritten and repurposed, and that span from the early 80s to the late 90s to maybe just past 2000, that to me is a big blank. And all I really have are what you might think of as the visible artifacts of all this activity. So although I can say the original publication concerning ARCAT was blah, 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 well, that doesn't really quite mean what it sounds like. So when I pick up, of course, one must pick up the original Cults of Terror. And one does not reference this without also, giving you the full page, Jacquet's cover. There you go. The material in here, starting on page 10, is a much more developed history of Glorantha than found in the original core book, which is a little sketchy, broad and sketchy and kind of interesting for sure. And then what was given in Cults of Prax, which is deliberately somewhat limited by the region that the supplement is devoted to. And it's this material in Cults of Terror, which really, from my experience, was the first kind of setting look, right? The big picture. Now, again, to a Glorantha file of that era, they would have said, oh, well, you're Johnny come lately, Ron. I mean, I knew about that stuff back in 1979 when it came out in this issue of Worm's Footnotes, and then in that argument at the convention a year later. Okay, so this, I knew all about that. Well, good for you. But I had to buy shit in a store, and I got this, okay? So this is where I first saw it, and where I think it's the first kind of bookish version of it. So again, as I say, page 10, mostly about the cosmology and the God's War and the birth of time. And then history, which is from page 16 through 20, which has these nice blocks of time periods of Glorantha, which the history part spans about 1,600 years. About a third of the way through those 1,600 years is a period that is called ARCAT and the Gabaji Wars. Now, one of the things that this is related to is geography. Most of the material made available about Glorantha and developed in play, and even before it was a role-playing game, concerns the center of the world, geographically speaking, which looks surprisingly like what people for so long here on Earth, our world, actual world, called the center of the world, which is the Levant. And if you look at the geography in Glorantha, it's all flipped around and stuff, but you're like, oh, I see, okay. And there's a lot of other Mesopotamian parallels in it. One of those parallels is to suggest that over in the West there are, other men, there are other cultures, and going all the way back to the original material, there's a very strong implication that it's got a medieval and Christian feel to it, men of the West. And of course, everybody sits straight up and wants to know all about the men in their plate mail riding around on horses with lances. I mean, that's what they want. And to a very small extent, back in that original material, that's what they got, in terms of a very sort of mysterious figure who emerges from the past and is also translocated in time and space. So therefore, here in the Dragon Pass region, we have this weird individual who's out of time and out of place from way over there in the West, and hardly anybody knows anything about this stuff in this region, but the Christian plate mail cavalry tropes are there in full force. Okay, but given a number of things that have been talked about by many people, including myself, the kind of westernizing of Dragon Pass sort of dimmed that a little bit. But anyway, the deal here is that there is constant reference back then and then through continuing publications and development of the lands to the west and their various history and how that ties in, to the mythologies that we knew about. As with all Gloranthan material, this is not being produced as a single person's input. This is being produced by this huge range of slightly rabid, often inspired, but often pretty bluntly not inspired applications. And it's all getting jumbled together in what is published versus what is accepted by a given regional play culture, and all the debates that go into that, which are just insane. And I just wasn't involved. So from the early 80s all the way up to about 2000, I'm checked out. I don't care what anybody's saying about any piece of Glorantha. I've got my old books and I like them, and that's all I'm really thinking about. So that's what we're looking at for those early publications, including, however, this material, which I have here an Avalon Hill later publication, a reprint of it, which is Dorastor, the Land of Doom. And this is a region that is near Dragon Pass, but isn't developed in the early materials particularly, although we are told, that it is a stinking, chaotic pest hole. Dorastor, the Land of Doom. And this supplement, which is extremely extensive, includes the origin of this land in the Arkad and Gabaji Wars. So here you can read more material. Now, I want to point out that material in Cults of Terror, which looks like kind of a standard role-playing game data dump of this extensive setting history of all this stuff that happened long ago, then the elves fought the dwarves, that kind of stuff, is really good. It's good partly because it's a very irresponsible mashup of appropriated mythology from everywhere, plus baking it in a time and place of its own origin with its own politics and its own psychologies, and comes together enough so that you recognize somebody needs to do something with this, because none of it quite gels. And that's part of its power, is that unreliable narration is rife throughout and acknowledged as such. And they're just never going to tell you, because, the authors, of course, like it this way, that it looks like this, and that's probably how they think about it themselves. So it's fun. It makes you want to play it, not to receive this incredible, rich and deluxe and vast, wealth of colorful sensory overload, so much as saying, I can do something with this. So Dorastor is an example of somebody doing something with this, and has a little bit much more of a kind of a canonical, this is how it was and this is what's there feel to it. But again, not so much that I think it would completely overwhelm a person, particularly if they hung on to their own notions of what this should be. Before going on to the other publications, for those of you who don't know, Arkad is a hero in the history of Glorantha, the After Time Begins, who undergoes a number of different incarnations. Radical shifts in identity, in ideology, in political impact, and is clearly somebody who makes a lot of decisions along the way, and a lot of them are a little obscure, and you tend to agree or disagree with different incarnations of Arcat as you read through it. And remember, the material is quite short. It's only a few paragraphs. It's not like you have to read tomes and tomes and tomes. So you read this and you go, oh, this was interesting. Now, what about Nisilor? Well, Nisilor is a created god who becomes kind of this enlightenment type, very, very Buddhist in origin, and seems very benevolent and all about, chaos is part of reality. It's not an abomination on reality. And basically is interpreted either at face value as Nisilor, the light, the enlightened one, or as basically, the door to abomination, Gabaji, right? The demon, basically. And the question of whether, Nisilor is a good god and Gabaji is basically just propaganda from the older thinkers, or whether this is just another incursion of chaos on reality and Gabaji is this smiling cultist, who suckers people in, is left up for grabs in these texts. And it actually goes to some pains to sort of make that as kind of up to you as possible. And so therefore Arcat battling Gabaji in these wars through all these incarnations and all these different kinds of, circumstances and the devastation that it wreaks upon everything. And the question of whether, Nisilor could have saved the universe back then, and was destroyed by this ideologue, or whether Arcat saved us all from, the demonics and the deceptive, the deceiver. Gabaji is the deceiver. Is left up for grabs. And this is part of why it's compelling. You're looking at this and saying they've really made a nice bunch of questionable, debatable, discussable, myth here for us to, play with as history. And Door being the largest or a very dramatic artifact of those events. And I will say that, the supplement is loved for many reasons, by myself included. One cannot help but fall in love with Ralzakark, the king of the brew, who has a unicorn's head. And anyway, it's quite fun. So all that material is what I encountered, what other people have encountered, and the notion that this is imminent for play is less powerful in that older material. Arcat and the Gabaji Wars are in the past. The Hero Wars have not yet begun. What happens in the Hero Wars is nowhere to be found in any of these old texts. That's just someday, soon the Hero Wars will begin. This is the age of heroes in which the heroes of the Hero Wars will be active. And, your dude, in case, just if he doesn't lose too many limbs along the way, will, be involved in those. Have a good time. Go play. Who knows what you'll do with it? Well, that of course changes as people become very invested in the One True setting and what will happen and is happening in the Hero Wars. And the texts start becoming very wrapped up in that, Stafford included. And what anyone says about Arcat in the context of all those discussions, and whatever publications may have been involved in God knows what venue, I have no idea. I do know that when Hero Wars the game comes out in 2000, which is basically Greg, Adesk, and Glorantha. Now, does that mean that it's pure and all the rest of it? No. I mean, Stafford himself has undergone many changes and changed his mind about publications and all sorts of things. So, as I have said many times, as far as I'm concerned, after 1981 or so, it's all fanfic, no matter who wrote it. So, that stated, if we check out Glorantha Guide to the Hero Wars, which was published just months after Hero Wars the game in the same year, 2000, we have a discussion of the Arcat Gabaji Wars. And one says, oh, okay, so this is going to be sort of the baked and, refined, at least the Stafford specific refined version. And what it is the same text all the way back from Cults of Terror. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. What I'm saying is, from my perspective, working only off of Cults of Terror, Door Store Lands of Doom, probably scattered mentions here and there in a kind of diffuse sense. And then coming to this much later text and finding the same text sitting there is reassuring. Maybe there was all that development. Maybe there's some culture of play out there which has an enormous set of library of all the things that happened with Arquette, what he said, and what was really going on with Gabaji and all the rest of it. And I don't care. It's still there to be done. So that was my response upon reading Glorantha, Introduction to the Hero Wars, and which is the title. I think I said it wrong a second ago. And that was my response, and I considered a positive one, an exciting response. So at that time, 20 years ago, when I was playing a lot of this, the thought of doing, Door Store based or much more Arquette Gabaji oriented stuff was very exciting to me. And I was, all the way back from Cults of Terror, was really excited that the Lunar Goddess actually had invoked, the spirit of Nisalor in her apotheosis. So all this was really interesting to me, both the positive and negative sides of all that content. And I touched on it a little bit in our game. There's reference to one of Rauzakark's lieutenants named Manslime. And I had, looked up a bunch of stuff and realized that there was, all this other development by other authors and stuff that I really wasn't very interested in. So I just kind of sliced it all back to what I knew from these limited texts and said, all right, I'll drag that stuff in, which I did. Not in any major way, but it made me feel good, right? To kind of rest one elbow of part of what we were playing on that material.